So I'll get started. Good morning. Glad to be back together and virtually seeing all of my fellow board members. And to those of you listening in, thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, just a couple of virtual meeting rules. As we always know, mute your mic as if you're not speaking. But also, let's refrain from using the chat room. As we know, this is a public meeting, so all of our comments should be heard by the public. So let's not use the chat room. Thank you all. The year 2020 has certainly been full of unanticipated events. And I know we are all eager to transition out of this crisis mode and perhaps just transition out of this year altogether. While there's still much uncertainty, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all OHSU employees and students for their steadfast commitment to the university's mission. This has been an extremely challenging year, possibly some of the most challenging times many of us have experienced in our careers. But it has been an honor to serve as chairman of the board and watch the OHSU community navigate one crisis after another in the name of serving our state and OHSU's mission. With that said, as always, we've got a full agenda with some really important topics to discuss today. We'll hear from Mr. Lawrence Fernstall, the EVP and CFO, on a revised budget proposal, and from Dr. Elena Andreessen, EVP and Provost, on proposed academic fees. As I'm sure you remember, the last time we met in June, we reviewed and voted on a preliminary budget based on March, April, and May data, when stay-at-home orders from the governor were in effect and all but the most critical operations were shut down. Due to the uncertainty of the extent to which COVID-19 and the impacting economic recession would impact our bottom line, OHSU agreed to come back with a revised budget proposal at this meeting based on additional financial performance information from June, July, and August. We greatly appreciate all the work and effort that has gone into this and recognize that this continues to be a complex and fluid situation. However, I'm pleased to see a budget proposal that puts people first, and I look forward to the presentation and discussion. We'll also hear from David Robinson, Executive Vice Provost, and Constance Tucker, Vice Provost, regarding the annual assessment update. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Derek DeVivier in his new capacity as Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Many of you remember him as the past president of the Faculty Senate. He, along with Dr. Peter Barr Gillespie, will be giving an update on OHSU's efforts towards cultural change and anti-racism. Due to the importance of this work, I have requested to keep the topic of anti-racism as a standing agenda item for every meeting. At this time, I'll turn it over to President Danny Jacobs for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Freeze. Good morning, everyone. I trust you can hear me. Thank you for joining us today. Chair Munfree's reference, when we last met in June, the focus both around the country and at OHSU was on COVID-19 and racism and their devastating effects. Though some things have changed since we last met, those two topics are still at center stage, and I think will continue to have a lasting impact, at least for the foreseeable future, next several years, on everything we do. Dr. Peter Graven, our own Dr. Peter Graven, has continued to provide written COVID-19 updates to the board and continues to study the spread of the virus. 2020 has been relentless, especially for us here in Oregon. Our people have been in a constant state of responding to one crisis after another since March, and that has just been, frankly, terrible. In addition to the pandemic, a social justice movement, and a financial crisis, we're now also dealing with the devastating wildfires here in Oregon. Many of our own faculty members and students have been directly impacted by wildfires, including 6 School of Nursing students who actually lost their homes. The air quality held at hazardous level for a very long time, and some of our own pulmonary experts, such as Dr. Gopal Alada, who's Associate Professor of Medicine, helped educate the public, and that included warning people to stay inside, stay indoors if at all possible. So once again, the importance of the work we do was made known to the entire state. It remains our privilege and our honor, as well as our responsibility, to lend our expertise and provide assistance, and that includes helping other health systems when they need it. Our COVID-19 Capacity Center, which was enabled by GE Healthcare Technology, developed in partnership with OHSU, and with other health systems across the state, this is the COVID-19 Capacity Center, was designed to allow health systems to monitor hospital capacity statewide in preparation for the COVID-19 surge. I would submit that we're not quite out of the woods yet. But we have thus far avoided the threat of COVID-19 overwhelming our hospitals. And this COVID-19 Capacity Center is also important in other ways. In fact, it was used to help support hospital systems around our state in fire evacuation zones. So I'd like to make sure to recognize and applaud our employees who worked tirelessly in coordinating OHSU's emergency response to the wildfires, and thank them for stepping in again when our state needed it the most. Among these many challenges, including the effects again on our members, there is some good news. A Dornbecker patient was the first human to receive a trial therapy for a rare and devastating form of epilepsy. Our neonatal intensive care unit received approval to allow parents and caregivers to wear clear masks. And this facilitates bonding by allowing babies to actually see faces and smiles, so important for the development of our children. Moving on, OHSU was recognized as a cardiac center of excellence by an independent patient safety and health quality accreditor. It's called DNV-GL Healthcare. Again, that's a testimony to the excellent care we're providing in cardiovascular services. I'd also like to say that OHSU is once again recognized among the nation's top performers for high quality care in the Vizient Quality and Accountability Scorecard, a nationally recognized body charged with this particular effort. We were again named a 5-star hospital, which echoes the 5-star rating we again received from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Overall, OHSU Hospital ranked number 14 out of 100 hospitals, leading academic centers nationwide, while our ambulatory services ranked number 11 out of 51 other medical groups. Even though we will not be announcing these things externally at this point in time because of all the challenges we have to continue to deal with, including COVID-19, we're extraordinarily proud of all of our members that contribute to our clinical mission, especially during these challenging times. As Chair Munfree's referenced, we also have some promising financial news. As he said, when we met in June, we were working on a budget based on March, April, and May largely, without knowing or having any predictive analytics necessarily about what the future held. We implemented a series of cost-saving measures, including reductions in salary for our faculty members as well as for our unclassified administrative employees. Again, this has been terribly difficult, of course, and painful as regards these salary reductions, most of whom, as I've said, are working harder than ever before. So I'd like to take a moment to thank them and acknowledge them, especially those who reached out to me directly to share their concerns. I'd also like to assure everyone that OHSU leadership has, from the beginning, been actively engaged in assessing how and when we'd be able to restore salaries by looking certainly week to week, if not day to day, at our financial metrics and other indicators. We needed a few more months, in my view, of financial performance in the books to review before we could propose a new plan of action. Fortunately, our financial performance for June, July, and August was better than anticipated, and we look forward to the board's vote, as Chairman Munfree again said, on the revised budget. This proposed new budget, among other key issues and items, includes lowering the increase in tuition put forward at the last board meeting, and a proposal to restore salaries for all employees who incurred a salary reduction going forward with the paycheck that begins in October. So a few things have gone as planned or as expected in 2020. Once in a century events, I don't think is an overstatement as regards what we're dealing with. But of course, these various challenges have also impacted our plans, our strategic plan, OHSU 2025. As regards this process, the magnitude of the disruptions, I think it goes without saying, has caused us to shift our focus to short-term and urgent issues as regards the tactics around the plan execution and tactics as regards addressing the other challenges, the current challenges. And this has included, for example, a greater focus on member safety and well-being, the supplies of personal protective equipment, managing the supply chain for this and other supplies needed, being very deliberate as regards reopening operations and research, education, and patient care, while doing the best we can to extend assistance and try to assist communities throughout Oregon. So therefore, these events have understandably impacted many of the things we had listed as long-term priorities, but they've also caused us to stop and look critically at some of the underlying assumptions that were part of the original plan. This is a moment for me to say that I believe every strategic plan, every good strategic plan, is a living, breathing document, and there is this continuous feedback loop which requires the priorities and tactics, and even sometimes the goals, the timeless aspirations, to be revisited on a regular basis as circumstances change. Now, the 6 goals that we originally identified with the help of the members, this was again a crowdsourced strategic planning process, have provided and continue to provide strong guideposts while we manage through our ongoing challenges. But as I suggested, there are some planned assumptions around economic environment, the social environment, our operational environment, our financial well-being that need to be recast to ensure that we achieve what we want to do by the year 2025, still a target as quickly as possible, which I think is in the institution's best interest, as well as in the best interest of those we serve. An example of that is we think there is ample opportunity and need, and frankly, a responsibility for us to modify our first goal to specifically address structural racism. Now, once we finish recasting our assumptions, we will reassess our objectives and modify them with input from their respective owners. Remember, each objective had an owner and a team around them in terms of implementing these objectives. They will be evaluated as before by our mission councils, and then we expect their recommendations to be presented to the university cabinet, ultimately to me, and then to the board for final review and approval. So there's a lot more to be said about the OHSU 2025 strategic planning process, and I would like to have the opportunity to present a more thorough update at our October meeting. And then finally, it will probably come as no surprise that the challenges we faced have impacted the plan, the year-end results for our FY20 performance indicators. So along with reimagining the OHSU 2025 objectives, we will also necessarily be revisiting and rethinking the appropriate indicators under this new framework. So thank you for the time, Chair Monfries. We have a packed agenda, so I'll turn it back over to you for the rest of the board meeting. Thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. We do look forward to hearing more about the strategic plan. We do appreciate the fact that the layering of cultural change needs to be part of that. So we look forward to the October conversation about that process. As we go forward, a couple things for board members. As you speak, remember to state your name for the record. As we get through the agenda, there will be opportunities to step up. So I just want to make sure that you guys remember to state your name. So the first thing we have to do some administrative work. You have the minutes in your packet, the minutes from the June meeting. So I will ask for a motion to accept those minutes.
So moved. Amy Tykes-em.
Second, Ruth Byer.
The minutes have been moved and seconded. Is there any question or comments about the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor? Unmute, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none opposed, Ms. Sealy, the minutes have been approved unanimously. Wanted to make regarding Dr. Jacobs' comments were with regard to the performance indicators. Because we have a full meeting, we did get in our packet a written update from Greg Moad about the performance indicators for 2020. We will review those as Dr. Jacobs said in terms of what the future going forward in terms of those performance indicators will be, and I look forward to a robust board conversation around those. As things have changed and the focus will be different on some of those items. Now, to review the FY20 unaudited financials, give us an August update, and discuss the proposed revision to the FY21 budget and academic fees. Lawrence?
Next slide, please. Thank you, Chair Monfries, members of the board. As you just heard, I'm here to present an update on our financial performance and propose for your consideration a revision to the budget for the current fiscal year. Next slide, please. As both the chair and the president noted, the budget approved in June was prepared using data from the depth of the initial impact of COVID-19. Due to great uncertainty from the pandemic and recession, we promised to return in the fall with a revision. Our priorities have been reducing the tuition increase and finding a path towards restoring salaries while managing risk. We now have June through August results, twice as much data, which have trended positive. The FY20 operating loss is $28 million. KPMG will report on their external audit in the October meeting. From July through February, OHSU booked a gain of $91 million for 8 months prior to COVID, followed by a loss of $119 million during the 4 months March to June, the first initial impact of COVID-19. These operating results are prior to $38 million of CARES Act support booked according to GAAP as non-operating revenue that we received last fiscal year. So far in FY21, we've received another $10 million in CARES Act support with no visibility towards additional funding. The total of $48 million received to date is $16 million below what we had previously assumed, and this is the only significant negative financial data point. Although fully $173 million below the original approved budget for fiscal year 20, the year-end deficit was less than half the loss projected from April results, with $6 million more revenue and $26 million less expense, especially in year-end health benefit spending, self-insurance reserves, and capital equipment bought from grants. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Slide 2. From 2010 to 2019, the university's net worth, all of our assets minus all of our liabilities, grew at an average of $214 million per year. And you can see on the table, FY18 and 19 were at or above that trend. And this strengthening of our balance sheet has allowed the university to borrow on favorable terms for buildings such as the new CHH2, which replaced and expanded capacities in the century-old Multnomah Pavilion. In 2020, for the first time in recent memory, net worth fell slightly by $14 million, with the operating loss and an especially large PERS pension accrual partially offset by the CARES Act, plus investment returns that reflected a very sharp decline in interest rates during the year that correspondingly increased the prices of fixed income securities held in the university's investment portfolio. Next slide, please. OHSU held cash and investments actually rose last year. The combined impact of the investment gains and $170 million of interest-free CARES Act loans from the federal government's prepayment of Medicare claims and allowing the deferral of FICA tax remittances. It now looks that repayment of these loans will occur in 2021 and 2022. The $1.4 billion in OHSU held cash and investments should be seen in context of our debt, shown in red there. $1 billion of bonds outstanding, $500 million of unfunded pension obligations owed to PERS, up about $50 million this year, and $170 million of the new CARES Act debt. Relative to academic health center peers, our ratio of cash to debt remains below average, a weakness previously offset by strong operating results. Next slide, please. Key budget decisions have included guaranteeing full pay to all employees from mid-March through June, the depth of the initial impact of COVID-19, despite a $200 million decline in revenues during that period. As the president noted, we wanted to tighten first in order to loosen later and avoid continuing rounds of reductions. We've worked hard to avoid widespread layoffs by reducing salaries of faculty and administrators instead. And we've acted as one university, even though different missions and different parts of the university would be impacted to differing extents and at different times. Based on the early March through April data, we projected an 8% decline in patient activity for the current year, a 5% shift from commercial to Medicaid coverage, tracking the state economist's projection of Oregon job losses, and large cuts to state funding for education and research. Noting that we learn more each week, we promise to return with a revised budget based on new data. Next slide. In summary, nothing in the fiscal year 20 year-end results was negative to the assumptions we used in FY21, and some factors were positive. Very importantly, aggregate patient activity in June, July, and August is within 1.5% of prior year, rather than down 8%. Although with 30 beds out of service due to their being in double rooms that can't be used under current conditions, thus fewer admissions, but with a much higher complexity, and continued growth in chemo infusion and other outpatient pharmacy services. 1/3 of OHSU's ambulatory visits are now virtual, increasing safe access to OHSU's programs. Next slide. Perhaps most surprisingly, we have not yet seen any shift in payer mix from private to government coverage. As I've reached out, this seems to be a national phenomenon across academic health centers. Hypotheses for this lack of a change include the smaller drop and faster recovery in employment than originally anticipated, more furloughs rather than permanent layoffs with continued health benefits, the focus of layoffs in lower wage industries such as hospitality and restaurants, where many workers may already be on the Oregon Health Plan, and the fact that families already engaged in a disease process could be more likely to buy COBRA insurance. In addition, the state legislature did not cut OHSU's funding during the summer special session. If all of these trends hold, OHSU should generate between $100 and $200 million more revenue than budgeted. For example, July and August revenue was $31 million ahead of target, which would annualize to $186 million over 12 months. In the revised budget, we've included about $120 million more revenue towards the lower end of this range. Despite the relative improvement, revenues are about flat year over year compared to the prior 9-year trend of 7% annual growth. Next slide. On Wednesday, the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis presented its September forecast. The prior June forecast, which was actually released at the end of May, was the projection that we used for the original FY21 budget. And you can see that forecast in terms of job loss is the very light dotted red line that's labeled June forecast. It forecast an initial 21% job loss with a 4-year recovery. The dark red line is the actual, and then with the dotted part, current September forecast. Actual job losses were 14% with a 3-year recovery. This is still very large, but nonetheless a smaller drop with a faster recovery. Next slide. This slide shows that most of the layoffs have been in lower wage industries. Again, think hotels and restaurants. This has had a disproportionate impact on low-income Oregonians, but as noted earlier, is consistent with little shift in payer mix, since more of these workers would already be on the Oregon Health Plan under the Affordable Care Act expansion of Medicaid. Next slide. The new state revenue forecast is shown on the line graph on the right. The top red line was the March or last pre-COVID forecast of Oregon state revenues. The dotted blue line on the bottom was that May-June forecast showing a significant gap. And the dark blue line in the middle is the new forecast showing some significant recovery. The new state revenue forecast closes essentially all of the gap for the current biennium and 1/3 of the shortfall for 2021-23 compared to pre-pandemic trends. Risks to this projection include failure of the federal government to provide additional stimulus that most economists, including the Federal Reserve, believe is required for continued economic recovery. Next slide, please. As new data has come in, the University Cabinet has discussed 4 key considerations that address risk-benefit trade-offs in an improving but still uncertain environment. Will current trends hold, improve, or worsen? How many more staff do we need to operate at current levels given COVID-19 conditions that slow every cycle time? How much revenue a budget should go to new spending and how much to salary restoration? And what should be the mix of prospective and retrospective salary restoration methods? Next slide. The following revised projections and revised budget are based on these data and discussions to date. Revenues are assumed to track the June to August average with some adjustments for known patterns of seasonality. Drug and medical supplies track patient activity, while other services and supplies are midway between their current low value and their higher pre-COVID levels, consistent with our commitment to reduce non-compensation expenses. All of these factors would result in FY21 operating income of about $50 million positive prior to further spending or salary restoration. Next slide. From this $50 million positive level, we would spend $19.5 million on staff required due to COVID-19 conditions, $8 million on emergency funds announced for childcare and wildfires, $4 million on salary equity adjustments, and $2.5 million for anti-racism initiatives. $1.2 million would lower the tuition increase to 2% in FY21, plus another $4.5 million over the following 3 years to restore the tuition promise for this year's entering students. We then propose to restore the full reduction in salaries taken by 4,500 faculty and administrative staff starting in October going forward. To be exactly precise, since we have biweekly pay periods, it would start this coming Monday, September 28th, coming forward with the first paycheck reflecting that in October 16th. This is a cost of $67.8 million. Together, these items result in a revised FY21 deficit of a loss of $55 million. We further propose that first dollar improvements above the $55 million deficit level would restore some or all of the July to September salary reductions that totaled about $23 million. Next slide. In summary, we propose to lower tuition, restore the absolute reduction in salaries going forward, and reduce the deficit by $40 million from a $95 million loss to a $55 million loss. We also propose releasing $37 million of high priority capital projects paused last spring and restoring a normal capital contingency for things that continue to break as we go forward in the year. On net, a $40 million improvement in the deficit would be partially offset by our current projection of $16 million less in CARES Act support and $6 million in additional capital spending. The revised deficit is still last year's loss and fully $200 million below our prior earnings level of a surplus of $145 million. To give a sense of scale, this gap is equal to half the cost of building the hospital expansion project that we deferred in June. Next slide. To conclude, there is still significant uncertainty. COVID cases may increase with the end of the summer. Payer mix may shift if temporary employer health benefits run out. The legislature will have to balance next biennium's budget. And the Affordable Care Act is once again before the U.S. Supreme Court on November 10th without Justice Ginsburg on the bench. In addition, as my cover note noted, OHSU is reviewing a very recent revision to the U.S. Department of Labor's guidance on the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This new set of regulations expands the pool of employees eligible for paid sick and expanded family and medical leave for specified reasons related to COVID-19, including caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed. This recent change, which does not affect our private competitors, could have substantial financial and operational impact, and as a public entity, OHSU would not receive offsetting federal tax credits. There may also be a difficult mix of gains and losses across missions and years. The clinical enterprise incurred significant losses last year, while other university areas ended fiscal year 20 above budget. As clinical volume recovers, a large cut to state funding may hit education and research in fiscal year 22 and 23. Continuing to act as one university will be essential. However, we believe that given positive financial trends to date and the fact that OHSU's balance sheet has not deteriorated, it is a reasonable risk for the university to restore salaries on a going forward basis in October. Reducing the tuition increase, reinstating the tuition promise for entering students, and restoring faculty and administrative salaries would reduce uncertainty for OHSU members while improving retention and morale. I'm very happy to answer any questions, and afterwards I will ask the provost to provide more information on the change in tuition.
Thank you, Lawrence. So I'm going to go back on my comments before about the chat room. So my comment should be we shouldn't have discussion in the chat room, but clearly last time in the other meetings we've used the chat room for you to indicate, board members, if you have a question or comment you'd like to make. So I'm going to open that and make sure that you use that so that we can keep it orderly and I can call on people as they've said they have a comment. So you just send a note in the chat if you want to raise a comment. So while you're doing that, I'll just make some comments myself. Lawrence, thanks for putting this together. I appreciate the thought that goes into it, the things that we're trying to do to preserve the financial stability of the university, given the uncertain times. I appreciate the commitment to the university community and trying to get us back to a place that we can get to with as little pain as possible. So thank you for all the contemplation, you and the leadership for all of this. It's certainly still difficult times and the university is still losing money. So I think that while we are talking about positive things, we're really saying that we're going to lose less than we expected to. So, but we're still investing back and giving back. So everyone's participating in this. We still want to keep the university solid in delivering its mission on strong financial footing. But these are difficult times, but we want to make sure that there's as little pain as possible across the community. So the first question I'm going to turn to Ms. Chamberlain, and then after Ms. Chamberlain, Ms. Khan. Stacy.
I just want to thank Lawrence for putting this together. Obviously, this is much better than what we saw previously, and really excited about being able to find the money to keep that tuition promise because of the impact that that has on so many folks that we're trying to support. I wish we would have found that money sooner, and I'd like to figure out a way when, you know, times are tough that this body can come together and look at reserves or other options to make sure that we are not putting folks in a stressful situation needlessly, and that we're finding that money early on so we prevent folks from dropping out of a program because they think they can't afford it later on. The second piece I had dealt with the faculty loan that OHSU took, or I guess the loan we took from our faculty is one way to put it. And I'm glad that we are going forward restoring those salaries. But I really do see that as OHSU taking a loan from their employees, and I don't think it's a right thing to do, especially when we have pretty hefty reserves. And I understand we're in a situation that none of us have seen before, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to manage this organization. But when we're at risk and we're facing something like this, and all of the employees and staff and students are in the same situation, asking them to give up money during a time of stress isn't something that we should have ever done. And so I'm glad we're finding the money. I think we need to actually pay them back the money we borrowed from them with interest, because that's what we did, and that's what our reserves are for. So I would love to see this body take that action today and not only restore their salaries, but pay them back the money that we borrowed from them.
Thank you, Ms. Chamberlain. If I may just make some comments just to frame that question. The board may recall that the original $95 million deficit cleared OHSU's debt covenants narrowly. And the risk there is our ability to come back to significant projects such as the hospital expansion going forward. The revised $55 million deficit improves that margin considerably. But we need to subtract the $16 million of lower than hoped for CARES Act support. If we repay now the $23 million, which is the 3 months that's still not done, we would subtract that $23 million, and then that would leave us little room from where we were originally. It would be within $1 million for additional negative financial impact. In particular, the recent change I noted to the regulations under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act could have a dollar impact in that same range. So we very much look forward to paying back the July to September cut, which impacted about 3,000 faculty and 1,500 managers or administrative staff of the university. But I personally believe it is more prudent to restore going forward as we propose, will be effective in fact on Monday, and wait a bit until the situation is clearer on the retrospective part. It is, of course, a board decision of bearing the risks and benefits.
Sure.
Thank you for that, Lawrence, and I appreciate you framing it up that way. I guess it is a philosophical discussion I think that the board has to have about whether or not we think that it's right for employees to bear the risk of things that are coming down the pipe instead of us as an organization. And so I think I appreciate what you have to say, but I think that that's where it comes down to it. And I think you know where I lie.
Thank you, Mr. Chamberlain. Ms. Khan.
Thank you, Chair Monfries. This is Lubna Khan for the record. Thank you, Lawrence, for sharing these updates. I think these are the steps in the right direction. I'm glad that we were able to get back on track of where we were supposed to be pre-COVID. But I think in echoing Stacy's remarks, I think we have an aspirational graph that we still have to reach. Even though we are back to pre-COVID, I think pre-COVID was the goals that we were hoping to meet with student fee reduction, more scholarships, wellness for our faculty and for staff, And I think we're on the right track. I think we'll trend that way as we continue to have more data. So thank you for sharing all of this. I had a particular question about the packet that we received, and that was the FY20 variance from budget. I read that the OHSU Health and School of Medicine ended the year at 217 million off budget. Is that correct? And could you just briefly explain what happened there?
So the overwhelming impact of COVID-19 was the fact that we had to stop elective procedures and generally reduce the amount of clinical activity starting in the middle of March. It was very low, down 40% in the month of April, and only started to come up in May and June as the state allowed us to resume, under certain conditions, non-urgent procedures. So the huge impact on revenue occurred first, and in FY20, almost entirely on patient revenue. Patient revenue is almost all of the revenue of health, the hospital, and is by the largest revenue of the School of Medicine, because that's where the faculty practice is. So it's not surprising that that impact would occur there first in FY20. Research revenue dipped a little bit, but in fact was really quite steady. We rebated a certain amount of tuition because of the inability of certain educational programs to go forward during that time, but also generally was level, as was the state appropriation. So the rest of the university tightened up on expenditures. I do want to also note, during that 3.5 months, where normally, at least for the clinical faculty, salaries would have decreased substantially because their activity and professional fees reduced, and we have variable clinical pay, we held everyone's salary. So what you see is the deficit or the impact is very disproportionately in the hospital and in the School of Medicine, because that's exactly where the clinical revenue is. If in the future, for example, in the next biennium, not this fiscal year, but the next 2 fiscal years, the state cuts our funding, either the state appropriation or the intergovernmental transfer funding, as part of the state's budget, that wouldn't impact clinical activity much or at all, but would have a significant impact on research and education activity. So the timing of different parts of the university occurs at different phases, if that makes sense.
Okay, Mr. Zika.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to emphasize that I really appreciate the conservative nature as we have been budgeting, and the fact that we're jumping back into this issue as things start to clear. I think that's the right approach. Having been involved several times during my career in areas where you run afoul of the banks or the lending institutions, I think Lawrence mentioned the debt covenant, but it's serious. I mean, banks can call your loans. And so we don't have that many levers to pull. And so we took the challenging one where we had to reduce some salaries of the higher paid people in the institution. And now we're restoring them quickly. So I think we've done a good job, and I support the action of the leadership team.
Thank you. I would just add, seeing no other comments, I would just add that I do feel, one of Ms. Khan's question about the losses or under budget. The reality is that in my mind, those losses that we had in the first 3 months of COVID are not coming back. And so we've had the losses, but yet we still are committed to trying to restore even the back pay at some point. I think the important thing is that it's still front of mind, top of mind, and as things continue to get better than we thought they were going to be, it's still on the table to give back. But what we don't want to do is give back too quickly and then have to turn around and make other cuts down the road. Still might happen because it's so uncertain. However, we are trying to do it as quickly and as responsibly as possible. I think as a board, we all have to look at the revised budget proposal and say, are we comfortable that we are being stewards of the financial stability of the institution as we move forward and make this adjustment? So that's I'll leave it there. Seeing no other comments, I believe it's an action for the budget. Do we need to have Dr. Andreessen go on the academic fees first?
If we could just ask the provost just to report briefly, then we have a combined resolution for your consideration, sir.
All right, thank you. Dr. Andreessen. You may be on mute.
You're on mute, Elena.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Munfries. I'm Elena Andreessen, Executive Vice President and Provost. Good morning, members of the board and our guests. Before turning to just a few tables that describe our proposal, I'd like to add some context and rationale that you've been introduced to. As President Jacobs and Chair Munfries said in their remarks, and you heard from Lawrence, at the last board meeting, we recommended and the board approved increases in tuition that were greater than our recent historical increases. Normally, we have increases from 0 to 3%. We proposed increases of 5% and 7.5%, depending on the funding source of programs. We also suspended the tuition promise for eligible programs for the academic year. So, in the last 6 months, we've had very few options for good news, but today we propose positive improvements over our June Board of Directors budget request. At that time, we said that if the state funding to OHSU were maintained rather than decreased, that would mitigate the increases to our tuition and fee proposal. And I want to just publicly acknowledge the very strong, successful efforts of our OHSU and other state public students for their strong and successful work with elected officials. Student voices count, and we received no cuts in our general fund or our IGT funding level. And if you recall, the Oregon legislature appropriation was expected to be cut by 17% for our general fund. It's just one example. So we can now propose to replace those larger tuition increases with a more modest increase of 2% across OHSU education programs. We also propose that the tuition promise be reinstated for the cohort of students who are entering eligible degree programs in 2021. And just as a reminder, the tuition promise affects nursing, medicine, physician assistant, dental, MS and human nutrition, BS and radiation therapy students, and a complete list of subgroups in those general categories are included on page 4 of the tuition and fee book. So let me just show you a few proposed tuition differences that will put this in context from the tuition and fee book. Next slide. So, back one slide as an overview. This shows you, let's call this 2% for basically arithmetic reasons. The 2% changes a little bit as you go from program to program, but those are the proposed tuition increases. Next slide, please. And this is more specific detail that provides an example of physician and dental students. The first year shows the tuition for this year in the MD, and then you can see the effect of the returning tuition promise students in the second, third, and fourth year of the MD program. If you go down to the last set of 4, you see the same thing with doctorate in dentistry. Next slide. And this one is the proposed percentage change in full-time tuition across the large set of especially clinical, but other programs as well. And as you see, and all of the returning students who had a tuition promise, that maintains their tuition. And you see the new entering tuition for students starting in cohorts for this year. So that really is the summary. I really know that you have a lot of additional detail, and we can answer questions on the revised proposed tuition and fee book that has additional information. So let me return this to Chair Munfries, and we can take questions.
Thank you both. I don't see any questions in the chat room right now, so I will have the board members refer to page 74 in their documents, resolution number 2020-09-04. I will take a motion to accept the revised operating budget, capital budget, and academic year tuition and fees.
This is Chad Paulson. So moved.
Steve Zika, I'll second it.
The resolution has been moved and seconded. At this time, any questions or comments? Seeing none, we're going to do a roll call vote. That's what I should have done for the minutes, but it was unanimous, so we won't go back and do that. But I will have Ms. Seeley call the roll for your vote. Please open your mic to approve or yay or nay, please. Ms. Seeley.
Thank you. Director Tyson.
Yay.
Director Jacobs.
Yay.
Director Khan.
Approve.
Director Byer.
Yes.
Director Chamberlain.
Ms. Chamberlain, you're on mute.
I was too quick with my finger. Yes.
Thank you. Director Zika.
Yes.
Director Paulson.
Yay.
And Chair Humphreys.
Yay.
Thank you. Eight yay votes.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mr. Fronstal and Dr. Andreessen for your presentation, and to all the leadership for their thought, and to the board members for their comments. We appreciate it, and all the comments are important to make sure that we have a robust discussion on these items. I will now turn it to Dr. David Robinson and Dr. Constance Tucker for the annual assessment update.
Chairman Freese, I will start. For the record, I'm David Robinson, Executive Vice Provost at OHSU. Thank you for inviting the two of us to provide you with our annual update on OHSU's activities related to the assessment of student learning. When we were here a year ago, I introduced you to Dr. Constance Tucker, Vice Provost for Educational Improvement and Innovation, who oversees, among many other areas at OHSU, OHSU's Comprehensive Student Learning Assessment Program. Dr. Tucker joined OHSU in 2017 from Virginia Commonwealth University, where she served as Assistant Dean for Faculty Development in the School of Medicine. As I noted in my introduction last year, I cannot overstate the tremendous impact that Dr. Tucker's contributions have had at OHSU, and she's already recognized across the institution as an educational leader, innovator, and mentor. Dr. Tucker will again provide you with our annual update, but first I would like to provide you with a quick update on Dr. Tucker by letting you all know that she was recently promoted to Associate Professor. This was extremely well deserved and is a clear recognition of her contributions not only to OHSU, but also across the region and the nation. So with that brief introduction, because I know Dr. Tucker has a lot to get through, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Tucker.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me okay? Is there a... Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction and would like to give you our annual update. So next slide. I want to start by just setting the frame for what we define assessment to be, and we actually, like true academics, answer that question with a question. And the important part of that is, what do we want our students to know and be able to do, and how do we know they got it? And when we're able to answer that question, we know that we're assessing their learning quite well. Next slide. The reason that this is important to define assessment and to do it well is that good assessment defines quality. And for us, that demonstrates that all of our graduates are proficient before they graduate. It reinforces equitable experiences because our graduates know what to expect when they come to get an education here. It aligns both our curriculum with our instruction, as well as our outcomes, and it differentiates us both locally, regionally, and nationally. Next slide. For those of you who are very familiar with quality improvement projects, they're cyclic processes. Assessment is the same way. And we assess learning in a very cyclic and ongoing improvement cycle that starts with learning goals and objective, which we call our graduation core comps, and then leads to learning activities that happen in the learning environment, both in the classroom and the clinic. And we continue to collect data that informs our practice, and we continue this cycle again to improve the quality of education. Next slide. I wanted to highlight the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities because they are our accountability partner in the journey on assessment. And this just shows you the Northwest Commission represents the states in red. Next slide. Historically, we have not always done an amazing job at assessment. And so I'd like to frame where we've been and where we are and where we're headed. 2015, we had a year 7 visit from the Northwest Commission, and we're told that we needed to ensure that we do a better job at demonstrating we were doing comprehensive assessment of student learning and connecting that data to improvements in academic programs. Next slide. And so a lot of work was done by numerous stakeholders to improve the quality of what we were doing. And that included a lot of professional development, both in the form of assessment academy series, as well as face-to-face and online now workshops for staff, faculty, and students to ask questions of experts within the Teaching and Learning Center. Next slide. And in 2018, we received the good news that we were on track with our assessment activities and prepared to continue a trajectory of a culture of assessment, which was great news for a lot of us. Next slide. So I show you the timeline. So I've talked about where we were, and here's where we are in the white, in the present column. And in 2 years, we are preparing for a 7-year site visit from the NWCCU, in which they will again ask us how we're doing with assessment. And so we are also looking towards the future about how can we maintain a high standard of quality and excellence and demonstrate that to our accountability partners in the NWCCU. Next slide. And NWCCU along the way has changed their accrediting standards and have a new focus, and those were approved this year in 2020. So in the next slide, I'd like to highlight the areas of focus in the new standards. And they're fourfold: institutional effectiveness, student learning, student support services, and student achievement. And as you can see by the number of times students are focused on, there's been a strong focus on student outcomes and student achievement in this new version of the NWCCU standards. Next slide. Because of this shift in focus and a lot of the work that the Institutional Assessment Council has been doing, we looked at revising our OHSU graduation core comps. The graduation core comps state that every single graduate who leaves OHSU will achieve and be competent in all of our competencies. And in the past, we've had 10 competencies, and some of which we tried to document achievement and competency and really found difficult because we hadn't fleshed out how to measure them and realized that we needed to reduce them and really refine our definitions on them. And so we are excited after a lot of work to bring you and present to you the changes. Next slide. So we are moving from 10 core competencies from 2012 to 2020 to a list of 7. So on the left side, you see the old, and the right side, you see the new. And the new, I would say, are a mixture of some of the old in those first 4, but the bottom 3 are what we will call the new competencies: information literacy, professional identity and ethical behavior, and community engagement, social justice, and equity. And we believe that these competencies reflect what the institution was already doing, but we weren't highlighting in our graduation core competencies in ways that showed that alignment, and will prepare our graduates for the future practice that they will have. Next slide. And I've said this, but I want to reiterate how many people have been engaged in the work of institutional assessment and the partners that we have in both students, faculty, and staff. in institutional schools and units, but also in institutional committees like the Student Services and Assessment Council as very strong partners over the last year and a half to make this core competency shift. Next slide, please. And because of all of that stakeholder work this summer, we were thrilled to be given the Excellence in Assessment designation as an institution for our work in assessment from the National Center for Learning Outcomes Assessment. And I want to just take a moment to read the first two sentences, which says that OHSU is committed to a culture of evidence-based decision-making and is moving towards becoming a national leader in health and science innovation. Substantial progress has been made in growing the assessment enterprise, including contributing to assessment scholarship and drawing on their own data and existing research to guide change. This year, we were one of 12 institutions nationally to receive this designation, and we just want to publicly thank many of the people who made this happen. And at that, I will turn it over to the next slide. Yes.
Just before you move on, there's a question from Mr. Zika, so I wanted to make sure we captured it in the moment. So sorry to interrupt you, but I'll have Mr. Zika ask his question.
Perfect.
Thank you. So this is Steve Zika, and I applaud the effort to narrow the focus on the core competencies. I think that makes sense. It's hard to go after 10 objectives or whatever. But could you explain to me, so safety and quality to me seem really, really important, and kind of where that's been folded in, and then what does professional identity mean?
Yes, great question. So the safety and quality obviously did not go away, but it also was folded into other competencies. And I can provide to the board the definitions of each of the competencies so that you can see where the breakdowns are. But professional knowledge and skills, we actually think a lot of patient safety and quality improvement exercises that were happening in the clinic belong there, as well as in patient-centered care. And so there was confounding competencies, so to speak, to represent that. The other, sorry, I'm going to forget the second competency you asked about. It was the professional identity and ethical behavior. And so I would say, I'll give you the formal definition if I don't have it in front of me, but the professional identity was meant to focus on the expectations of one's profession and the responsibilities. We're trying to move away from professionalism as a term that can sometimes box our learners into standards that are not appropriate, and really focus on the professional expectations rather than personal expectations. And so it's a bit of a shift away from that. The partner term to that was ethical behavior, which we think is a better replacement of the term professionalism. So it's it's a revised version of professionalism to focus on things that can be measured.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Tyson also had a question.
Yes, this is Amy Tyson for the record. Dr. Tucker, congratulations on your promotion, and thank you for your contributions to this great progress. My question is, I was curious about the graduation core competencies and the metrics that are used and what the sharing across the, I guess the pool of institutions is towards best practices as we move down the road. Is there quite a bit of sharing that goes on to refine those metrics and core competencies, or is each institution kind of on their own and coming up with what they think is best for their situation?
Yeah, great question. I'll try to simplify the answer to say that bachelor's programs have the most sharing nationally. So we can get a lot of data about our bachelor's programs. From the health professions, there's sharing amongst some schools more than others. And so I can do a lot of benchmarking by school. I would say that our graduation core comps, what makes us slightly unique is that we're an institution with very few bachelor's programs. And so our core comps do look a little bit different because we are a health science institution and don't have a huge undergraduate education. And so what I would say is you'll see some overlap, but not a complete overlap with undergrad institutions nationally. But we do have peers like UCSF and others who were able to do some benchmarking and comparison for sure.
Thanks for those questions. And I realized that your next slide was the question slide, so they were timely.
There you go. Thank you for your time.
Great. Any other questions from the board? Ms. Khan, please.
Hi, Dr. Tucker. Thank you again for sharing this. I just had a question about, especially in the era that we're in with, a lot of information, a lot of science, and, a lot of people having different, talking about data in different way. I was wondering if there's on the student end, if one of those competencies also involves robust, scientific research, as well as sharing that with the general public, and how we're going to make students be able to be the advocates like Dr. Fauci in the future.
Correct. Yeah, I think that you'll see that reflected in numerous competencies. So there's not a competency that reflects dissemination, public dissemination specifically, but I do think that you'll see information literacy looks at how we absorb information and process it and then give it back to the public. You'll see that reflected as well just in our professional skills and knowledge competencies. And I would say our community engagement and social justice, right? So I think all of those things that you mentioned are covered probably across 3 competencies that come to mind, but great point.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tucker. I don't see any other questions. This is great that we're tracking this, and you're on the job. And again, congratulations on your promotion as well. And we look forward to continuing to hear from you and on the progress. And congratulations on the recognition as well.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Drs. DeVivier and Dr. Bar Gillespie to talk about our path towards anti-racism. And it's for me, it's a cultural, it's an investment in our cultural environment, right? To make this a place that everyone feels welcome and included, and a great place to work. Anti-racism is certainly a strong part of that, given where we are in the environment today. And so I want to thank you both for your work, and recognizing that it is a institution-wide effort. And you guys, you may be at the point of it, but it takes everyone to build this culture that we have. With that, I'll turn it over to you guys to present to the board. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Monfries. This is Derek DeVivier. I am the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I'd like to thank everyone for this opportunity and to wish everyone a good morning. I think what I would like to do first is to address some issues that are on the current headlines, most recently on the 22nd. And it is important to note that the plans and content of this presentation were developed prior to the most recent executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. We will follow the most recent advisory by the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education and analyze our risks through an ongoing legal review. This is with regard to anti-racism work and diversity and equity inclusion work. It is possible that we will have to identify other ways to meet our objectives. I would like to read from the most recent statement from the AAMC, of which OHSU is a member. The central purpose of diversity and inclusion training is, in fact, to bring the country together, not to further divide it. Only through better understanding of our conscious and unconscious biases, learning about other cultures and our pluralistic society, reaffirming our commitment to being anti-racist and challenging long-held beliefs that we hold ourselves and that we hold about others, we will heal the divisions now shaking our nation to its core. The AAMC and the academic medical institutions that comprise our membership are committed to being diverse, inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist organizations. We believe this training is needed now more than ever. The AAMC intends to continue our trajectory of pursuing and even increasing such training, and we urge our member institutions and other affected organizations to do so as well. That being said, I would like to be clear. Although our methods regarding this work may need to change, we are committed to being a diverse, inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist organization, and we will continue this most important and relevant work. Next slide, please. So I think it's also very important to give some context to where we are and the environment that we are in while we're conducting this work. On January 20th, 2020, the first known case of COVID-19 in the United States was identified. On February 6, 2020, the first documented COVID-19 death in the United States was registered. And today we are still faced with a worldwide pandemic in which approximately 6.8 million Americans have been diagnosed with COVID-19 and over 200,000 Americans have died. This pandemic has wrought havoc on communities of color, including Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous Native American. These communities have borne the brunt of the ravages of COVID-19. In Oregon, our Latinx communities make up approximately 13% of the state's population. However, they make up almost 40% of the number of COVID-19 cases. This disparity of COVID-19 disease burden in marginalized communities of color is a result of well-documented historical structures, systems, and policies that have resulted in social and economic conditions that lead to health disparities, abysmally poor health outcomes, and appallingly lower life expectancy. On May 25th, the recorded death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police shocked the world and sparked a civil rights action that elevated into the national consciousness the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the historical and systemic devaluation of Black lives. The common tie that links these events, racism, is a public health crisis. On May 31st, OHSU President Dr. Danny Jacobs called the OHSU community to join the university on this transformative journey to becoming an anti-racist institution. Quote, "This crisis demands the attention of us all. We cannot permit the loss of any more lives by sitting idly by and simply hoping for change. We must shatter the structural racism that perpetuates these cruel acts against people of color. The time to end racist-fueled discrimination and brutality is now." This change to an anti-racist institution will be centered around our continued implicit bias training, as well as the dismantling of structural racism. This diagram before you from the National Museum of African American History and Culture demonstrates the relationship between the two. Historical events of slavery have led to the creation of policies and practices that promote white privilege, which in turn lead to inequitable outcomes and racial disparities. These have in turn been used with narratives and priming events to create harmful assumptions and associations, both conscious and unconscious, about people of color. That is, people of color are inferior. During our transformation, we will need to work within the realms of the individual, a person's beliefs and actions that perpetuate oppression, the systemic, that is institutional, policies and practices at the organizational level that perpetuate oppression and how they contribute to the promulgation of racism across both institutions and society. And lastly, at the level of the interpersonal, the interactions between people, both within and across differences. Next slide, please. OHSU is now challenged to define itself through a process of self-examination and analysis. Such an analysis will enable us to create a vision of the university that combines foundational work that is currently being done, such as implicit bias training, and new anti-racism work that is currently underway or in the process of being defined and developed. Tools like the continuum on becoming an anti-racist multicultural institution can be helpful, and this is the slide that you see before you. This tool can help us with organizational assessment and facilitate change. The organizational challenge that OHSU faces is to bring all segments of OHSU into alignment along this continuum. Next slide, please. I would like to transition at this point to discuss the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. The center is a central hub for diversity work, including anti-racism work at OHSU. Our role at the university can be defined by the acronym TEAM. T for training. We provide DEI training, expanding our program offering to include anti-racism training. Most recently, we conducted our first session of anti-racism training with the PA class of 2020. We are currently receiving feedback and fine-tuning this program for broader distribution across the university. We are involved in education. We educate. We are expanding our educational resources to support the anti-racist journey, both personal and institutional. In doing so, we have partnered with the library to develop and grow a centralized source of educational material, including books, lectures, videos, podcasts, and movies that are relevant to our anti-racist transformation. We are involved in activating and advocating. We will work to operationalize programs and in doing so, advocate for members of our community. For instance, we are partnering with Dr. Eden to modify the Respect for All app that provides resources for sexual harassment and gender bias to also include resources for racial harassment and bias. We monitor. We will work to monitor DEI and anti-racism efforts across the university. By doing so, we will provide a measure of institutional accountability. And lastly, and I apologize, there's actually a letter missing here on this slide, and that is S. We support. We are here to support OHSU and the communities we serve. Next slide, please. With regard to the CDI's role in monitoring and documenting diversity efforts across the institution, I would like to present this mock-up of our dashboard for unconscious bias training across the university. This is a mock-up, so the numbers are purely placeholders. It is our anticipation that this dashboard will go live within the next 2 weeks. I would, at this point, like to publicly thank the human resources team that worked and did a great deal of lifting to get us this final product. What this dashboard means is that we now have the means to track unconscious bias training in both the foundations and hiring managers' curriculums across the institution. As you see on this first slide, we are able to break it up in both the Unconscious Bias Foundation and the hiring managers segments. Next to that, we have the areas, organizational areas across the university. This is true for both AFSCME, external faculty, fellow house officer, and so on. We're also able to track organizationally, central services, the Office of the CFO, the Office of the Chief of Staff, Healthcare, Provost Office, Research, and the School of Medicine. What this dashboard does not include at this time are students. We are currently in the process of creating that dashboard. The expectation is that we will have that ready in about 2 months, and that will be complementary to this dashboard. If you can go to the next slide, please. We're able to really drill down on the data here and get pictures, diagrams that really express the information in a very apparent manner. Next slide, please. And next slide. What is fantastic about this dashboard is that we are able to look across the entire OHSU footprint. So we're able to look at training by location. To the right, you will see we can look into Ashland, from Ashland to Scappoose, the Dalles, Vancouver, Beaverton, as well as our central campus. As we bring more DEI programs online, with some modification, we will be able to use this data architecture to monitor progress. I would like to emphasize that this scorecard for unconscious bias training is just one example of the kind of data that we will need to track as we continue on this journey to an anti-racist organization. Lastly, I would like to conclude with a quote from the most recent letter from the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education that was written in response to the most recent executive order. The NADOHE urges higher education to continue and strengthen its existing commitment to racial equity and DEI workshops, seminars, courses, and lectures that explore racism in all its harsh reality. We cannot fix the scourge of racism if we negate its existence. We cannot end violence against the Black community and other minoritized groups if we do not foster dialogue and understanding. And we cannot welcome our students without addressing structural racism. It is our responsibility to prepare our students to work and live in a diverse society. We cannot accomplish this goal if we cannot discuss race and work toward ending structural racism. In sum, OHSU is at an inflection point. The confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the public health crisis of racism has brought to the forefront the leadership role that anchor institutions like OHSU must take. The fulfillment of our responsibility to maintain the well-being and health of all Oregonians is dependent upon it. By combining the work of implicit bias education and the dismantling of structural racism through anti-racist activities and shared accountability, we can achieve a more equitable and just outcome for all Oregonians. Thank you. I'd like to open up to questions.
So Ms. Khan has a question.
Thank you, Dr. DeVivier, for sharing and for doing all the important work in the small team that you have in CDI that does very, very important and massive work. Thank you. And thank you to Dr. Jacobs for prioritizing this and, for really taking a strong action in light of recent events to make our institution an anti-racist institution. One of the things, Dr. DeVivier, that we've talked about even in the board previously has been, the impact of the unconscious bias training. I think the dashboard that you shared is very, very nice to look at. But, one of the things that outcomes-wise would be very nice addition to the dashboard would be we have trained this many people and we can see that the environment, the hiring process has changed. We've added more diversity as a direct, it's not a one-to-one, and I understand that. But, if it is contributing, I think it would be very nice to see how much it has contributed if we're going to, go, and I think we already are in the process of, making this almost a requirement for everybody across their different missions. The other thing I was curious if you would know is there's been a lot of dialogue about increasing training. I was wondering if you know of any research that, shows that unconscious bias training truly, relates to these outcomes that I'm talking about that we potentially might see. Is there like a one-to-one, is there some connection there?
Great, I appreciate the question. If we can go back to the diagram from the National Museum for African American History, this is why this diagram is important. Our work with unconscious bias training was a first step. It's a foundations. It is not meant to be a one and done or a standalone process. As we transform into an anti-racist organization, there is that confluence, that relationship between the unconscious bias training as well as the dismantling structural racism. They feed each other. There is data out there. In some areas, it's questionable whether or not the implicit bias training will make an impact. But this was never meant to be a sole training process. In addition, this is a scaffolding, right? This is a process by which we learn and we see our blind spots. That's only one step. The next step is what tools do we have to mitigate the impact that those blind spots can have? And so we are in the process of standing up other training. So for instance, active bystander training. We are also in the process of bringing in training out of the University of Virginia, it's called Stepping In, which brings together both active bystander training, implicit bias training, as well as those tools that one can use to mitigate the impact of what we very frequently see in society are microaggressions, but also macroaggressions.
Thanks. I guess, and thanks for the stat and the like. As I said before, you're the steward, but it takes the entire community to lean in on this, and I know you will lead that. Following up to Ms. Khan's comment, though, knowing where we are is important. knowing where we want to get to along the way, because it's an evolution, right? So we can put in, hey, this is what success looks like, but success is just another step down the road. So I look forward to when we discuss the FY21 performance indicators, and as we go forward, what some of those milestones will be as we put some things in to say, here are our numbers today. This is where we want to get to in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years, and having those types of conversations, because I believe we have to hold all of the leadership and all of the members of the university community accountable in some way to drive change and to drive results. And it's hard to measure, but we won't have to create the wheel here. There's a lot of institutions that have to measure this, that will be measuring this, and we can lean on them and best practices to identify what tangible measurement items we can look to see that we're making progress. So I look forward to hearing that as well as we go forward.
May I follow up on one thing?
Absolutely.
This dashboard has other utility also. So for instance, if we see that participation in the training is low, that may be a marker of culture that we need to investigate, right? That allows us now to shine a light on a particular area and to investigate what is it that's causing low participation, and really start to investigate and push. It's also possible that we can take the information from here and compare it or correlate it with reports of behavior and see if there is a cause and effect, or a lack of participation, once again, being an indicator of culture. So there's a lot of application here.
Excellent. Thank you. Seeing no other questions, we'll move to Dr. Barr Gillespie.
Thank you, Chair Monfries. For the record, I'm Peter Barr Gillespie, Executive Vice President and Chief Research Officer. To follow up on Dr. DeVivier's presentation, I'm going to focus on the research mission and what does being an anti-racist institution matter to the research mission. There are a number of things. So first of all, in the research world, we're human beings like everyone else, and we feel the pain of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues to national events. Just even a couple of days ago, of course, the lack of significant charges against the Louisville police who callously killed Breonna Taylor is something that's just appalling. So our BIPOC colleagues in the research world can't do their best work when they have to work within a racist and white supremacist structure. Moreover, the actual research we do matters. We serve many communities with our research, and it's important that we provide robust results that allow physicians and patients to make informed judgment about care. And historically, the broader research community has not served the Black community well, or other communities of color, with our traditional focus on whites. Women know this too, because only in recent years have we worked hard to shift away from the gender bias in research. And you can even ask questions about the whole structure of science, whether we need to ask what racist and white supremacist features blind us to the sort of distortions that the structure of science may apply. So I think it's important to ask questions and see where the answers take us. And it's just important to consider that we have work to do. So what are we doing in the research community at OHSU? So first of all, not enough. That's a given. However, I feel that it's really most important to be consistent and in this for the long haul. For me, that means the rest of my career. Actually, it means the rest of our careers for all of us, rather than doing a bunch of things and then letting that work slide. We've all done this. I have done this. I have let things slide in the past, and I need to not do that in the future. So in a insightful New England Journal of Medicine editorial, Kevin Gutierrez, who's a clinician and educator who's trying to bring critical race theory, narrative medicine, and decolonial theory into medical practice, said it well. I'm concerned about this overnight change in institutional vogue. I fear that anti-racism curricula may distract us from the very institutional problems that got us here. So I think that our statement that we want OHSU to be an anti-racist institution is fine, but we need to be thoughtful in how we achieve that. Gutierrez worries that training doesn't reveal racism, but can in some cases cover it up. And he argues that an institutional racist curriculum can draw attention away from the real challenge, which is to identify and make the changes that are needed to allow Black and other people of color not just to coexist at our institution, but also to thrive. And in the research world, that means thrive in their research positions. So at the same time, we need to increase representation within staff, students, and faculty of people of color, but we're not going to be successful in retaining those folks unless the environment is conducive. So to change the environment, it's going to take time and commitment. I think the steps that my office have taken so far are relatively small, but I want to just mention a few of them. We've been funding programs for a number of years now. One to train underrepresented minority post-baccalaureates so they're prepared for graduate school, as well as to provide support, a training program for postdoctoral fellows. And we're continuing those programs, and we want to expand them and do what we can to increase their impact. A good example would be to hire some of the postdoctoral fellows that are coming through our program. So we're doing a few other things, as you can see from the slide that's projected. So first, all along, I felt that it's important that communication from leadership be honest, timely, and consistent. So COVID-19 has, forced us to communicate much more. The immediate crisis in March and April led us to communicate daily to the research community, and we've tailed that off to twice a week. But I've been using that channel to speak out for racial justice as honestly as I can. So in those communications, I've called out my own white privilege. I mean, I'm a old white male. I'm at the top of the privilege list here in our societies, and it's really important that I acknowledge that. I've also called out my own white fragility when it appears, and have spoken bluntly about how white people like me have been blind to the way in which white supremacy permeates our culture. I actually find it liberating to take words like racist and white supremacist and move away from the caricatures we all have of the nasty racist and the evil white supremacist, and realize that these terms apply to many of us and certainly apply to me. And while that elicits feelings, I need to work through that and understand how the understanding that I'm part of the system can help me to drive the changes as well. So communications are important, but they don't really solve problems. They maybe engage a wider range of our community. So we need to do more than that. I have sponsored a pilot program for the Racial Equity and Inclusion Centers concept that was put forward by the Alliance for Visible Diversity in Science. And the board knows about this. They presented a proposal to the board. And while the proposal was maybe premature for the whole institution, I thought it was really thoughtful and wanted to give them the opportunity to prove the concepts that they put forward. So we're going to start a pilot program within the Volume Institute, just a single institute at the university. We wanted to start small, and I also wanted to start at a place where the leadership is committed to changing organizational culture to promote racial equity. And we'll build out from there as soon as we can. So one of the key differences about the approach that AVDS proposed is that they dive deep into a community first to gather data, to understand the organizational culture of that community, and then provide tailored racial equity education and work to specifically empower those members of the community to actively change the culture. So it's real ground, on the ground work that they propose to do. And only once they've engaged the broader group do they engage the racial and ethnic minorities within that community. They recognize the need to mobilize everyone in the community first. So based on the work that they do, then they'll develop policies that will help either that single organization or the whole organization dismantle systemic and institutionalized racism, and in fact have a guidebook for doing the work as it gets spread out. Finally, I've been trying to motivate research groups at OHSU to have their own anti-racism discussions within their labs. I think it's crucial that we have top-down programs like what Derek has described. I think they're really important. But change at our institution, I think we all know, will only happen if we work at the ground level up as well. That's one of the reasons I endorsed the REI Center idea, and it's one of the reasons why I reach out directly to the research community. So, as you know, if you can go back to the next slide, please. As you know, as part of the research restart process, we required all research groups to write up a return to research plan. And we exploited that process and added another question, which asked each group to describe how will your lab engage in work that improves your research programs or department's culture regarding race. And, there are a lot of research groups at OHSU. We got nearly 500 plans, a interesting wide range of responses. And we have integrated those responses with other anti-racism materials and provided a very preliminary guide for labs to have these discussions. We used a first of a series of town halls on anti-racism to discuss the proposed approaches. We have plans for future town halls on additional anti-racism topics. We plan to have this be a regular event for our community. So I do worry that the town halls bring on board the people who are already engaged, and there are a large fraction of our community that are too busy or indifferent or whatever to be part of the process. And we continue to think about how to make our efforts reach as many people as possible. So we have a long way to go to transform the research community and OHSU as a whole towards making them an anti-racist institution, but I am committed for the long haul. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parker Gillespie. As others maybe form questions, I haven't seen anyone indicate that they had a question. I'll commend you for stepping up in leadership in your space in research and that community and the things that you are doing and engaging the community to be better and also recognizing where you can personally be better. And I think we all should take a look in the mirror and see where we can be better. So thank you for that leadership. My question is about the integration between the things that you're leading in your area in research with CDI and Dr. DeVivier, for example, with the REIC and the other ideas that you're doing. How is that coordinated with the work of CDI? And that may be a question for you or for Dr. DeVivier.
I mean, I can speak first and Dr. DeVivier can chime in as well. I think tight integration between CDI and what we are doing is really crucial. And Derek and I have discussed this. We intend to have the REI Center have a connectivity to Derek and the CDI, so he can monitor how they're doing as well as I can. I don't intend to do things in a vacuum. I want to be a partner to Dr. DeVivier. I want to do what I can to engage the research community. He's got a gigantic task on his hand, as you know, and we have a very large institution with lots of different areas of types of work going on. I know the research community quite well, and I want to help Dr. DeVivier as best I can in helping him reach out to that community.
Yes, absolutely. So Dr. Mark Gillespie and I have already met, and I've actually had our first initial meeting with the folks who are going to be responsible for this program. So we're going to maintain lines of communication. And I think what's going to be fantastic is the ability to develop best practices out of this program that we can then extend across the university through, the central lines of communication that we have out of the CDI. I think it's also important to remember that anti-racism work is a very important aspect of the work that we're doing at the CDI, but there are also other diversity issues that we also need to be responsible for and keep our eye on, and really focus also on intersectionalities. So there's plenty of work to do, lots of room for people to jump in, and we applaud it and support it.
Yeah, I don't want to say that I'm not supportive. I think that trying different things and doing new things is important. And as you both mentioned, identifying best practices is something that can be CDI and can be rolled out in other areas. So I applaud the efforts, and I applaud the efforts to do things differently and to try new things to be better, because that's what it's going to take. And I also recognize CDI has a broad remit, broad portfolio. And again, applaud Dr. Barr Gillespie and what we're doing from an anti-racism perspective in the research area.
I am very sensitive to your concerns, and I think that one of the important parts is maintaining lines of communication, and to that we're very committed. And Peter and I have worked on other programs together, and so we're going to be very sensitive to that also.
I completely agree, and I look forward to working with Derek and more in the future too.
Great, and I'll just state again, thank you both for presenting here. I look forward to hearing from the other mission leaders of the institution on the steps that they're taking to do this. So again, applaud you both on your efforts. Congratulations, Dr. DeVivier, on your new and growing and expanded role. So we look forward to you leading this, and we applaud Dr. Barr Gillespie on his efforts. So I don't see other questions from the board, so I want to thank you both for your presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you. As I said, it's going to be something on each board meeting agenda. Hang in touch. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I will now move on to some more administrative things that we need to do. We have Resolution 2020-0905 with regard to the board committee assignments. As I've said before and spoken to each of the board members individually, want to make sure that our board experience getting different experiences on the subcommittees of the board. So we've had this conversation. We moved some board members around to different committees. On page 106 of your materials, you have the new committee assignments. I will take a motion to approve the resolution for the committee assignments for the coming year.
So moved. Amy Tyson.
Is there a second?
Second, Chad Townsend.
Thank you. Any questions on the committee assignments? Hearing none, I'll ask Ms. Seeley to call the roll. Please respond yay or nay, yes or no, approve, disapprove, however you like.
Director Tyson.
Yay.
Director Jacobs.
Yay.
Director Khan. Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Director Byer.
Yes.
Director Chamberlain.
Yes.
You're muted.
said yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't know what the delay is. I apologize.
Director Zika.
Yes.
Director Paulson.
Yay.
Chair Monfries.
Yay.
8 yay votes.
Thank you all. I think unless there are any comments, we can adjourn until 11:30. Is that correct, Ms. Seeley?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining again. It's always great to get together and talk about what's going on. The content was significant as usual, and so I look forward to speaking again, I guess, next month. We have the next meeting in October. So we will adjourn for now and reconvene with the private board meeting at 11:30.